Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero. Our guest today is Leslie Ann Jones. She's a multiple Grammy-winning recording engineer and a pillar of the recording industry, having worked with such tremendous artists and producers to include, you better get a chair, Miles Davis, Quincy Jones, Herbie Hancock, Carlos Santana, Narada Michael Walden, Marcus Miller, The Manhattan Transfer, Maynard Ferguson, Confunction, Frankie Beverly and Mays, The Whispers, The Meat Puppets, Najee, Andy Narell, Angela Bofield, Alice in Chains, Chickenfoot, Rosemary Clooney, and B.B. King. She's a past chair of the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences Board of Trustees. NARIS is the organization that issues Grammy Awards. And just this last January, she was inducted into the TEC Hall of Fame. Pete and I were at the TEC Awards, which is right in the middle of the NAMM show. And if you're in the music industry and you're not a member of NARIS and NAMM, you need to quit playing around. Go to NAMM.org, that's NAMM.org, and see for yourself about how they help all of us in the music and audio industries get better and raise the bar. And along with the nice folks at Skywalker Sound, the publicity team at NAMM helped put us together with Leslie. Anyway, Pete and I saw at the TEC Awards, which we also like to call Audio Nerd Night, just how much Leslie is respected and adored among the professional community and our mutual friends. She makes her living now as the director of scoring and music recording at Skywalker Sound, where Rachel and the team made us feel very welcome, and I encourage anyone with a project, large or small, to reach out to them and get it done there. They're not the Empire, they're the Rebel Alliance. They'll work with you to get it done and make it awesome. Joining me as co-host in this episode is our frequent collaborator, musical mentor, and many times guest, including episode number 1 of the Break It Down show, James Earley. He produced, among a zillion other things, the soundtrack to Rocky V at Capitol Records in Los Angeles, and his engineer on that project was none other than Leslie Ann Jones. So this was a reunion that was a lot of fun to witness, and again, we owe Rachel at Skywalker and the whole publicity team at NAMM our thanks for coordinating. You're going to love this conversation with a true legend behind the console, a pioneer in the business, and an absolute gem of a human being. Here's Leslie Ann Jones.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
I'm Mindy Abair.
This is Andy Summers.
Hi, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Mick Gillette.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, my name is Leslie Ann Jones, and you're listening to the Break It Down Show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
We are in the control room here at Skywalker Sound in the TEC building here on Skywalker Ranch, which is stunningly beautiful.
Thank you.
Leslie Ann Jones is a recent inductee into the TEC Hall of Fame. You have built an illustrious and storied career as a recording engineer in places and with artists who we all know and love. And I had the pleasure of watching you inducted into the TEC Hall of Fame with great affection by none other than Herbie Hancock.
Yeah.
That was a lot of fun. And then we also have our dear, dear friend in common, Larry Batiste. Mm-hmm. And just that whole night for me was great because I had spent the whole week at the NAMM show, and just to sit still for a little while and watch all of that unfold was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was a really great show this year. I mean, my award notwithstanding, it was a lot of fun. Even if that hadn't happened, it was a lot of fun this year. Great host and everything else. And Larry's band always does a fantastic job.
Well, he's been doing it for a while now.
Yeah.
And it was fun to go down there. Now, when we started this endeavor this year, my intention was to go to the TEC Awards and do a long overdue piece on Larry and Claytoven, because they've been doing this for so long that it amazed me that nobody's done a profile on them.
No, I'm so glad to hear that you did that. Because they deserve a lot of love for what they've been doing all these years.
Well, and they certainly would say the same of you. You and Larry and Clay both said that the first real gig that they got was because of you. And, we can put quotes around real gig, but the first studio session that they did for a bona fide band where they were really in there and doing a professional level gig was with Nicholas Caldwell.
Oh, yes, and the Whispers.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Larry says that they got that gig because of you.
Well, that's nice of them.
Is that not true?
To say that. I'm sure it is true.
Yeah.
And I'd say it's nice that they remember that. Yeah, those were fun times. That was back in the Automat days in the early 80s.
Yeah. So for our listeners, there was a studio in San Francisco called the Automat, and it was a place where a lot of records that you'd know and love got made, and you worked there, and you at some point were the chief engineer there. Is that true?
No.
Oh.
Chief engineer is more the person who takes care of maintaining everything as opposed to being the head recording engineer.
Yeah. Wow.
So the chief engineer at the Automat would have been the person responsible for maintaining all the equipment and all the other people on staff who fix things, designed equipment, and things like that. Now that kind of person would be called like a technical director, for instance. But
that's a better name.
Yeah. I was probably, Fred Cotero would have been maybe considered the chief engineer. He was David Rubinson's engineer, and when I came, he was doing most of the projects with Herbie and the Pointer Sisters and all that. And then, after some time being there, I was doing quite a bit myself, the Whispers and other people. Confunction, Frankie Beverly and Mays, lots of sort of R&B household
foundational
names.
acts of the Bay Area R&B scene.
Right.
I brought James Earley with me. James, when I said, hey, man, I could use a little help, I'm going to go to Skywalker, and we're gonna have Leslie Ann Jones on the show. And I never have to ask James, do you know who that is? Because usually the answer is, oh, I worked with that person. And indeed, the two of you had worked together on the Rocky V soundtrack.
Yes, happy to be here. I'm honored, honestly, to be in Leslie Ann Jones's presence. She's a phenomenal, to say phenomenal engineer is absolutely an understatement when we're talking about this young lady. And by the way, on that note of Confunction, Felton Pilot and Michael Cooper and the guys say hello.
Oh, that's great.
I perform, sometimes I play bass with them even now, so they wanted me to tell you hello.
Those are just seriously fun times. I got into this R&B thing there, and it was fun because I've always loved that kind of music anyway, and I wish more people were doing those kinds of records now because it's just plain fun,
Compared to what you're doing now, what was it that you found about those records at that time that really did something for you as an engineer?
Well, I think it probably was from a listening standpoint, first of all, because I just love that kind of music.
Yeah.
I love the rhythm of it, live horns in the case of Confunction.
Yeah.
And Frankie Beverly's music always had such a mean groove to it. So, yeah, I think it started from a lot of that. And then, just from an engineering standpoint, that was back in the day when people would play in the room at the same time and they'd work up their parts and everybody would do it. And there was some editing. It was all analog then.
But a lot of dependence on live performance being really rehearsed and spot on and people having the chops to put it down.
Yeah.
Yes, that was true about the music and the musicians, but also true about the engineering. You can echo that as well, Leslie. I mean, you had to be good at what you do to be a part of it.
Yeah.
I don't know that's
because that was a live performance, and I mean that in even the figurative sense. Everything was live, and the person whose job it was to capture it had to have a feel for it and had to have a common goal in the sound.
Right.
The obvious barrier that you had in this business coming in was being a woman engineer. Did you get the people looking at you sideways like, I don't know if I'm going to have it? Because it was a man's world when you started in this industry, was it not?
Yeah, it kind of still is.
Yeah.
Speaking of Confunction, I think I remember sitting in Studio B at the Automat and waiting for the band to show up. And I think it was Felton, actually, who came in and put his head into the control room, looked at me, and he said, "Who's our engineer, or when's our engineer showing up?" And I said, "Well, that's me." And he just looked at me kind of quizzically and sort of went, "Okay," and but you just sort of get through that, and by the time you start working on drum sounds, everybody loves you and you can't do anything wrong, So it's like I learned to live in those days with minimal expectations and making the most out of that, because then the minute I met what was a minimal expectation, then I was everybody's favorite person, And you can use that to your advantage, It's a hell of a lot easier, I think, than coming in and having high expectations
right.
and having to fail,
Going the other way,
which
yeah.
is sort of the way it was at Capitol, for instance, as a studio, not
an organization.
Not gender related,
Yeah.
but people would have the expectation that because you were a recording studio owned by a record company, that they had very low expectations, I think, coming in, thinking that you were union and the equipment would be old and nobody would be, everybody would have to look at their watch at noon and take their lunch break. And so at Capitol, we found we had to exceed their expectations.
That's exactly the opposite of what you're...
Right. And then here at Skywalker, of course, everybody already thinks it's going to be fantastic. So you not only have to meet those expectations, but exceed them as well, because people already think it's going to be great.
Yeah. Well, this place is fantastic. Everything around makes it look like it's on you, because there are no limitations. And then when you go out, and we went into the live room where you can record a 100-piece orchestra out there, and I'm sure you have.
Yeah.
But everything out there, all the panels on the walls move so you can create the acoustic environment that you're after and do whatever you want in there.
Right.
In your career, though, you've gone from those times where the gear was limiting. You had what you had. And now that you're in an environment where really you can create anything you want in here, do you think that coming from a limited environment where you had to scrap, almost like playing on a baseball field that's muddy and rocky, and
right.
Does that prepare you for this environment in a way that, I mean, if you had had all of the opportunity to work in a place like this from the beginning, would it be an advantage or a disadvantage?
Well, a place like this didn't exist in the beginning, so I think that I was just talking to somebody last night about having gone to the NAMM show this year and attending these fantastic interviews or workshops. Bill Smith and Howard Massey did one about the late Jeff Emmerich, and
the Beatles engineer.
Yeah, the Beatles engineer. And Eddie Kramer, who was, of course, Jimi Hendrix engineer. Those talks were very much about that was in the beginning of course, I was still in high school then, but it was the beginning of when people really started to explore wanted to do different things musically, and your technical things were so limited that you had to really be creative about how you were going to do it. So I think for me, of course, I started later than that. I think I started in 1974 at a studio in LA called ABC Studios. But it was still about people playing in the same room and being able to record it and using, good microphones. But it was more about developing your own style and your own ethical sense almost about how you were going to do your records, what was important to you, what made you feel comfortable in terms of the equipment you would use, and those sort of things that have stayed with me my whole career, so that no matter how complicated the technical end gets, I still have this kind of basic thing basic foundation, that I have that has carried me through.
Kind of your procedural signature.
Yeah. But also for me, my career has not sort of shifted into those kinds of records that have 1 million producers and 1 million engineers, and each crew is working on one tune for somebody's album. Generally the work that I do is I'm working on an entire album. If I'm not recording and mixing it, I'm either recording it or mixing it. I'm mixing something that I didn't do.
Yeah.
So it's a little different for me, but that's a long way of saying that the thing about having all the tools we have here is that they do allow you to kind of explore your creativity in a different way.
I see.
So you have a a big, beautiful sounding room with a very low noise floor. You have a lot of great outboard equipment that you wouldn't normally have in a scoring stage, and that allows us to do all different kinds of music. And really, if you hear something you don't like, then you can just be creative about it. You can pick a different microphone or put the person in a different spot in the room, or many things that you can do. So that part of being here, I think, has really increased the potential I have to kind of explore different things that I wouldn't have done earlier because technology didn't
demanded
allow it.
of
Yeah.
you or
Right.
either demanded of you or allow it. I think, though, it's safe to say that everybody who gets here, because this is, one can say all of that lack of limitation is nirvana for a recording engineer.
Mm-hmm.
And since that's the case, everybody brings a different sonic foundation. And so your idea of, let's put him in the different part of the room, or let's take her and put her in a place where she's facing the wall, or just the different things these are all things that you learned in those circumstances of limitation.
Right.
And everybody's got different ones.
Yeah.
So how many of you are here and creatively learning from each other in that way? What's the size of your staff here?
Well, on the scoring stage itself, there are two of us, myself and Dan Thompson, and then the way Skywalker works is many people that work on projects are project-based, so they come in for the work. So
right.
I think next week we have a scoring session that's going to have 4 of my staff on it, and then 1 outside engineer. So it sort of ebbs and flows. But we all learn from each other. Dan will do projects, and he'll come to me, and if I end up having to do the same kind of thing, he said, I tried this the last time. Why don't you try that? Or we'll try out, different sets of microphones and stuff and turn each other on to things.
Now, you are the daughter of Spike Jones.
I am.
How much of that zany experience of being his daughter and seeing him work has influenced your sonic signature?
Well, it's funny because I don't think in the beginning I thought it influenced me at all, other than my sense of humor, which has gotten me through a lot in my career. I would say if you get into sticky situations with people, that having a sense of humor is really helpful.
Yeah.
But I've sort of come to realize later in my career the influence he had on me in terms of my love of orchestration. Orchestration being kind of how all the pieces fit in a musical arrangement or composition, which instruments are playing what parts, what the sound is, how they all need to fit together as disparate elements to create a whole. Mm-hmm. And I think what happened to me is I saw one of my father's charts from when he was going from mono to stereo, and in the score, all the sound effects were actually written in as musical notations.
Terrific.
Not only that, but what would come out of the left speaker, what would come out of the right speaker. Here would be a gunshot, here would be a cowbell, here would be a burp, and, all these sound effects. And that's when I realized that spending all my childhood listening to him and hearing how all those pieces worked together really influenced me.
Yeah.
That's important because he was actually orchestrating and arranging the sound effects as well. It wasn't just the music. It was an orchestration of everything, the whole.
Right. Kind of like a radio show in the old days where you'd have people talking and, a table of people doing sound effects and all of that. And it all had to be timed perfectly. It was all done to a script. Mm-hmm. And so I tend to listen to music like that as far as orchestra or string quartets or even pop or folk bands that I tend to work with. How are all those pieces going to fit together? And sort of, pop, folk, Americana kind of music, too. You've got a lot of things in the same range.
Yeah.
So you've got a couple of guitars, you might have a fiddle, you might have a banjo.
Mandolin, maybe, yeah.
Might have a mandolin, a keyboard. If it's female, then you've got vocals kind of in the same range. How are all those things supposed to fit together? And, again, we're here, and we can, of course, move people around. We can, change the microphones that are on them. We can affect the sound with tones, adding treble or bass or EQ, all that kind of stuff. And hopefully you're working with a good composer and arranger that has figured all that stuff out, so that everybody's playing what they're supposed to play, and all you have to do is...
And stuff is on purpose.
Yeah.
And your job is to capture it.
Exactly.
And there's an actual performance for you to capture.
Right, yeah.
How did you get started at ABC when you were working there? You said that was your first job? Mm-hmm. And...
She said ABC Records.
Not affiliated with the American Broadcasting Corporation.
No,
right?
it was
like
owned.
ABC
It was owned by the American Broadcasting
okay.
Company. Yeah, ABC TV.
Yeah.
They had a record company called ABC Records that later became ABC Dunhill, and they had a recording studio on Beverly Boulevard, which is where the record company offices were. And I was working for I'd been a guitar player and singer when I was younger, and had a home studio a long time ago when Tascam first came out with a console that was maybe 3 feet wide.
Yeah, size of a suitcase.
Yeah, and you could actually record stuff.
Yeah.
They had a...
You could track at your house.
Yeah, they had a 1/2-inch 4-track, and so I owned a...
that was revolutionary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and... So I had a sound company with a couple friends of mine, and we would go out and do live sound for bands. But my day job was working for ABC Records. They had a publicity and artist relations department. And so I was working in the artist relations department. They had a studio, and I actually decided I wanted to be a producer and a manager, and never thought about being a recording engineer. But I thought I should learn something about recording before I went off and tried to produce records. And so they had a studio, so I asked if I could have a job. Mm-hmm. And the studio manager, who was Phil Kay, a wonderful engineer, he was just honest with me and said, well, we'll have to see how the guys feel about having a woman in the control room, but
that dynamic existed even then, and he was willing to take a chance with you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then it was your job to show them that you knew how to do it, and you got right to work.
In a manner of speaking.
Okay.
I mean, in those days, you started kind of in an apprentice position. So my first job was making tape copies. We had a room that had a bunch of cassette machines, had a bunch of reel-to-reel machines, and at that time, record companies would send copies of their records. So, for instance, take Steely Dan, because they recorded for ABC, although I never really worked with them. So if France wanted to release a Steely Dan record, then I'd have to make a copy of the reel-to-reel that was done in mastering and send that to France. And then France would take that and make their own records from it.
Wow.
So that was my job. And if people were working in the studio and wanted to take a rough mix home with them, or if the executives needed to hear what the latest thing is people were working with, we had a bank of cassette decks, and I would do that. And I had a 4 p.m. to midnight shift. And my shift manager was actually Jim Harris, who had been a tape op on my father's records.
Huh.
So that was kind of my first experience that has followed me through my whole career.
Wow.
Of working with people that my parents had worked with.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then from your job as a duplicator, essentially, you worked up to probably miking things, or what was next?
There was a client that came in with a French singer, and they needed to change their schedule, and the assistant assigned to the project couldn't do that schedule for some reason. And so my boss asked if anybody wanted to do it, and I raised my hand. So that was my first assisting job.
Wow.
I had helped set up microphones and things like that, but we were with one of the first studios in Los Angeles that had automated consoles, and I knew nothing about that, so I used to excuse myself and say I was going to the restroom and run off to the tech shop and ask questions about how I could do things. How does this work? How does that work? And I'd come back and I would just point and say, just try that button. that should take care of it. And, they must have thought I had quite a bladder infection because of all my trips to the restroom when I was actually just cheating and going.
But you were coming back with answers.
Yeah.
So they thought, well, you know what? Just ply her with coffee and send her into the restroom. She'll come back and tell you what to do.
Can I ask you, Leslie, who was like the biggest influence as far as mentoring for you in your career, the biggest mentor or most important mentor in your life?
Well, that's really hard to say because I had so many, Like at ABC Studios, I started doing a lot of R&B stuff with Reggie Dozier, who is Lamont Dozier's brother, and the late Barney Perkins, who went on to be famous for working with Anita Baker. They were two of the busiest engineers. I got a chance to assist them and then do their overdubs and then do some of their tracking.
Wow.
So they were mentors in that sense. I also worked with Roy Halley, who was most famous for doing Simon and Garfunkel, and he was head of A&R for ABC. He was a big mentor of mine, but sort of everywhere I've been, there have been people. When I got to the Automat, it was Fred and David, and when I was at Capitol, there were always, even down to the person that contracted the orchestra that kind of taught me how to blend a sax and a trumpet together, who's supposed to be the loudest in that. I consider all those people mentors of mine because I think they saw that I really wanted to learn, and I wasn't embarrassed that I didn't know, and I was willing to seek out what the best way was to do things. Mm-hmm. But if there was one mentor, I would suppose it would be Roy Halley.
Okay.
Thank you for that question, James, because really what I would like for our listeners to get out of this as we celebrate your Hall of Fame career is that there are steps that typically involve somebody giving you a hand, learning something. And the biggest thing that our listeners are going to escape with, I think, and I hope, is that your example involves just showing your willingness to learn and your willingness to work.
Yeah.
And that's true in any field of endeavor, whatever you're into, recording or otherwise. As you started to progress as an engineer and learn things, how about your parallel path as a singer and guitar player?
That kind of stopped when I started in the studio.
Yeah.
I just got to a point because I was in a band with my cousins, and one of my cousins was a songwriter. We got signed to a couple of labels, but nothing ever came out. But we were recording with the best musicians. I mean, people, I was just talking the other day, Hal Blaine, rest his soul, was playing on some of my records.
Wow.
And, other people from the Wrecking Crew. And, so then I was in a top 40 band and I was in other bands. And you get to the point where I was self-taught. And if I wanted to be the kind of guitar player I admired, then I would have had to have gone back to school, and it was kind of too late for me.
Yeah, you're going to have to select something.
Yeah, I had to pick something, and unfortunately for me, it was sound.
Yeah.
I started doing sound for other people and realized that I could have as much, if not more, effect on their career and their sound by doing that than I could ever be standing on stage playing.
Yeah, but I think it helps anyway. As a producer myself and engineer and recording artist, I find that it's best for me to work with an engineer that is also a musician because we have somewhat of a shorthand about certain things.
Right.
They understand.
Or at least has been. A player on the other side of the glass.
Well, I kind of think once a musician, always a musician. No, that's kind of the way I feel about it.
You have that sense of what it's like to be on the other side. But I would say for my own, like I said, I was self-taught. So any of the work that I've done throughout my career to really try and learn how to read music and figure out orchestrations and things like that, that's all stuff that I really had to commit to learning because if I wanted to grow as an engineer and be able to do different projects and be able to communicate with the people I was working with, I had to learn that, And I learned that at Capitol because they took the big main room, Studio A, that was the room that Nat King Cole and Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra all recorded in with, all those great Nelson Riddle bands and stuff like that, and took that and redid the room. They added ISO booths, a big control room, and all of a sudden we started getting these small orchestra dates for TV and film because the only other room in town that was available for small bands, the musicians didn't like. But it was a whole other language. You know, what cue you were working on, and it was time code and syncing and all that kind of stuff. And I realized if I didn't want to seem foolish when I was working on these sessions or not understand what I was doing, I had to learn that language. So I took a class on film sound. That was film sound kind of from beginning to end. And then I felt much more comfortable working with those clients because then I could speak their language and I could
understand what their concerns were and focus on what was important to capturing it from their standpoint.
Yeah, and I could go back and forth from, looking at a piece of music and talking about bar numbers and letter A, and then working with clients that didn't work with scores and talking about verse, chorus, bridge, And you have to, if you want a long career in this business, you have to be able to move back and forth in both of those worlds. But again, it was me taking the initiative to realize what I needed to know.
And then going out and seeking it out.
Yeah.
Not in the cheater environment, but going back to school and doing it.
Yeah.
Lots of great lessons here in this path, and some of them have to do with making some choices and committing to learning something and understanding what your client's wants are. And
we're in a service business. It's always about what the client wants. And no matter where you are in your career, as Al Schmidt likes to say, it's not our name on the front cover, it's theirs.
It's theirs,
we're
yeah.
lucky if we're on the back cover.
Wow.
So it's not about me, it's really about my service to them and what they want. So before every big scoring session, I have a conversation with the producer or the composer about what kind of sound they're looking for, how is it going to be used, and all of that. And that informs my microphone choices, how people are going to be set up in the room, all of that, because I'm here to record them. They're not here to make my life easy.
That's terrific. You know what I learned from Al Schmidt? You know that red part? Don't go up there.
Right. Danger.
Words of wisdom from Al Schmidt.
Danger.
The approach of doing right by your client in the environment that you're in now here at Skywalker Sound, I bet that just introduces a whole bunch of different dynamics. I mean, you just mentioned the difference in language from where you were in the score to, hey, let's do that bridge again. And now you're talking about just so many more complexities at each level. What is it you think there's left to conquer if you're scoring the types of movies that you score here? Is there something where the industry is headed where you think that there's going to be big problems to solve? Or are you at the point now with the way that people make music for film that, you can do anything you want?
I do a lot more records than film scores myself, but I think the same thing applies to, no matter what you're recording music for.
So you get a lot of recording artists who come in here and make records?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, we actually do more of that than we do scores.
That's kind of neat to hear, because I almost got the impression that you had sort of taken on scoring as a new discipline and that we weren't going to get many more records out of you, but that doesn't sound like it's true at all.
No. I mean, we do probably 60% records and 40% scores, either scores for film or video game scores, because those are very...
That has exploded.
Yeah, a lot.
What bands have recorded here recently?
Oh, I think the last band that was here, we have had Joe Satriani here.
That makes sense. He's not far.
Yeah, a band he put together called Chickenfoot with Sammy Hagar.
And Michael Anthony.
Yeah. So we get bands like that, Steve Miller, and then...
Also not far.
Yeah. And there's a local singer, Pamela Rose, who I've done several records with. Her latest is a tribute to women blues singers, and she has a whole multimedia show about that, so I produced her cast show recording. And I think that's probably what I'm doing more now, is producing records than just engineering. Yeah.
Oh, that's terrific.
Yeah. But in answer to your question, I think probably the biggest challenge we face doing the kind of work we do now at this level is hoping that the audience is able to hear it in the way we intended it. So I tend to do a lot of evangelizing on high-resolution audio. I have been for decades involved with the Recording Academy, the group that gives out the Grammy Awards.
Yeah.
And we have a high-resolution initiative, and I chaired the committee that wrote that paper, Guidelines for Music Engineering and Production. There are more high-resolution streaming sites and download sites now, and of course, high-resolution is anything better than CD quality. So my challenge now is to try and educate people that it is really important if you want to hear the music the way the way we hear it and the way it's intended to be heard, that it really can't be streamed at the lowest rate like Spotify or Pandora.
Yeah, that's just not fair to the music.
Well, it's not fair to the music, and it's not fair to your enjoyment of it either, and it gets very tiring. So, there's kind of recreational listening, which is sort of, having headphones on when you're vacuuming the house.
Yeah.
And that's fine. But there's also sitting down and
really enjoying and
really
digesting a piece of music the way it was intended.
Yeah, really enjoying the music for what it is. And so that's my personal challenge now, along with a lot of my other colleagues in the Recording Academy. We work awfully hard here to make things sound as beautiful and as fantastic, and to get squeeze every ounce of detail out of the music that we record. So it's a real shame to me if people can't enjoy it that way and experience that. Because, music has an emotional component to it. And I think it's that people miss when they're not able to listen to it in a great environment. It's no different than watching a movie on your phone rather than going into a movie theater and watching it and, having that bigger-than-life experience.
Mm-hmm. I was curious, Leslie, when you're producing, just to your point, I was wondering if when you're wearing your producer hat, do you choose to engineer that as well, or do you step back and just let somebody else do that so you could focus on the production, or just wear both hats because you can?
That's a good question. I kind of pick and choose depending on how complicated the project is. Mm-hmm. So there are times where Dan Thompson he and I will co-engineer, and then so that I can concentrate on so we might consult with each other on the microphone and the placement and stuff like that. Once we start recording, he's sort of responsible for making sure everything gets recorded right and all of that, so that I can just concentrate on reading the score and making sure we get recorded everything that we need. And then I usually mark my score with all the edits and all that. Sometimes I edit, sometimes I have somebody else do it. Mm-hmm. And then I usually mix my projects. Something that came out in the fall, a project called Unbreakable, composed by Andrew Lippa, who's a Broadway composer, and he wrote a piece for the San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus. So we had 4 principals, the chorus, an 11-piece chamber orchestra, and we recorded it live at the Norse Theater, and I was working on a project at the same time here, so I couldn't be there for the recording. So Robert Gatley and Sean Martin, one of our, 2 of our other engineers, did all the recording, which turned out great. So that's really the first time I produced something where I haven't had some hand in the recording.
On the knobs.
Yeah, nice. But I do. So I'm sort of trying to learn a little more how to wean myself away from that. I think if I was doing more complicated projects, then I might not do any of the engineering. Mm-hmm. But I'd like my sense of how I want it to sound as a producer and as an engineer are very interconnected. Mm-hmm. So I haven't been able to give that up quite yet. On the things that I just engineer, I'm very fortunate that most of the producers I work with are more than happy to hear me chime in, which I do as judiciously as I can, because it's their record. Mm-hmm. And
but they know they can put it in your hands and trust you with
yes,
it.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And that's why I like doing video game scores so much, actually, because it's a very collaborative environment, and you have people in the audio departments of the video game companies that are all musicians. They're all composers, so they know music. They've hired composers, so they all work together, and they welcome my input in terms of if I hear something that, I think is being missed or wasn't played well, or, things like that. So I really enjoy that. It's much less about segmenting your jobs or you're just the engineer, but having said that, I think you have to know when to talk and when not to.
Sure,
you know?
sure.
And if things are being covered, there's no reason for you to say anything.
Sure.
Yeah, our job as hosts a lot of times is that we just get out of the way.
Yeah.
But I do want to mention two things before we go, because I want to plug two people. First is Cookie Marenko.
Yeah.
She's got a label that allows you to purchase a piece of music at a fidelity that makes you comfortable. And if you really want to spend and support the artist making beautiful music and recording it beautifully, that recording is a little more expensive than the just give me the MP3 I can listen to while I'm washing my car.
Yeah. Well, she has Blue Coast Records.
Yep.
And so I think Cookie still does physical product.
Mm-hmm.
And she engineers a lot of her own work and has a wonderful artist on her label. But she also has a download site. I believe it's called Downloads now. And you can go on there, and if you just want to download it, you can pick the fidelity that you want based on the higher resolution.
rate,
and, of course, the bigger rate costs more. But she also does a lot of DSD work, which is direct stream digital, which is also very high resolution, high fidelity. And she's been doing that for a long time.
The other person I wanted to mention is Fran Strine. He's a filmmaker. He made a movie called Hired Gun. Mm-hmm. And when he made that movie, he needed to score it and just decided, oh, what the heck, I might as well give it a shot, because he lives over here in San Rafael, although he spends more time in Los Angeles than he does up here. But he just picked up the phone and he called Skywalker and said, hey, what do I need to do if I want to score my picture over there? And he said he got a response that was just downright unexpected, which was that everybody wanted to make it work. And everybody wanted to give him a facility where he could be the most expressive and get it done and really have an opportunity to make the picture great and do it within a budget that made sense.
Yeah.
And so before we dismiss Skywalker Sound, as I did emotionally, as the place where it's Nirvana, I'll never get to work there.
Yeah.
But the reality is that, if you're working on a project and you will really want to do it right, you ought to pick up the phone and get it here, because it might just happen.
It very well could. I mean, one of the things that I've learned is that we are yes people here, and that really started from George working on early Star Wars and people having to create props, create robots, create
monsters,
CG,
yeah,
create sound effects that had never been heard before because nobody has been in space to hear these things.
Uh-huh.
And so the company, I think, started with this culture of being a yes company.
Make it happen.
Make it happen. And that has continued. Even though, of course, George no longer owns the company, that is part of the culture here. And that when you walk in the door, our job is to make it happen, whatever it is you want. And if I have to spend 5 hours on the phone with you before you get here to try and figure out what it is you want, then that's part of it, And it's the same thing on the film side, which is what allows us to work on the biggest films and the smallest films. And it's a very yes mentality, but that is something that has continued with this company since the very beginning.
And something that has continued with Leslie Ann Jones that has made her career spectacular and that leaves a lot of stuff in her professional wake that we should all enjoy. So I want our listeners to look Leslie up and get to know any of the things that she's done that have touched your life. And I would like for everybody to feel encouraged that somebody who has made it to the TEC Hall of Fame made it there because of a willingness to work, an enthusiasm for the work, and an ability to see a path to a customer's end goal that has made everybody want to work with you. Thank you so much for spending the afternoon with us.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad you could be here.
Yeah. Thanks, James.
Thank you, sir. And the lovely Miss Leslie Ann Jones, thank you so much for everything.
Oh, you're welcome.
It's always a pleasure.
Great to see you again.